I'm very pleased to be here once again for our Women Human Rights Defenders study. And today we have two witnesses. First of all, Fernanda Elena San Martin Carrasco, who is coming to us by video conference from Bolivia. And I do want to extend the apologies of the committee to you, Ms. San Martin. We understand that your last appearance was canceled due to the House continuing overnight. So I do apologize that the committee, I know we regret terribly that we weren't able to meet with you when you were here in Ottawa, but we're very pleased that we can have you today by video conference. And we also have today Joshua Cooper, who's from Al-Kist. It's an organization that advocates on human rights violations in Saudi Arabia. So the reason normally we're doing these by geographic region, but of course because we weren't able to get Ms. San Martin during the last time, we have had to do Bolivia and Saudi Arabia in one meeting. So my apologies for that, but I'm sure that the committee members will have many.
Alors, je suis sûre que les membres du comité auront un grand nombre de questions. Alors, comme vous le savez, vous avez 10 minutes pour faire vos remarques liminaires et nous inventons Mme Saint-Martin à faire ses remarques de 10 minutes. Et à destination des membres du comité, il y a interprétation avec espagnol. Merci. Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente, membres du comité. C'est un honneur pour moi de me faire entendre en cette occasion. Il y a eu des problèmes par le passé, mais c'était indépendant de notre volonté. Un instant, s'il vous plaît, le temps que nous réglons les problèmes d'interprétation.
So you have to select your language and then hit.
Yeah, no, but we did, but we were overrun by that booth. So can we try?
Yeah.
Oh, so they were on the wrong channel?
So Ms. San Martin, could you...
My name is Fernanda San Martin. And I want to thank you very much for inviting me here. So thank you very much to all of you for this opportunity to be able to speak to you today and to your committee. I would like to start by telling you where I'm from. I have always been interested in
Resume. My apologies for the delay. While we're working out the interpretation with the Spanish, we will actually go to Mr. Joshua Cooper and ask Mr. Cooper to please do your 10-minute introduction, and then we will try to go back to Ms. San Martin. So go ahead, Mr. Cooper.
Okay, sure. Well, yeah, firstly, thank you all very much for the invitation, and it's an honor to take part in this important and timely study. Unlike some of the previous speakers, my personal story is less relevant as a British male and less interesting, but as the chair said, I'll be speaking today as representative of Al-Qist, which is a human rights organization focusing on Saudi Arabia, and it was established in 2014 by a Saudi activist, Yahya Assiri, who unfortunately can't make it today. But since then, it's taken on a sort of leading research and advocacy role, so I'll be speaking in that capacity. So today I'll be talking about women human rights defenders in Saudi Arabia, specifically addressing the situation of women's rights in the country, including the male guardianship system. Secondly, a brief history of the women's rights movement. Thirdly, some of the risks that women human rights defenders face, both in terms of general risks operating in an authoritarian environment, and secondly, in terms of the patriarchal social structures in Saudi Arabia. I will address briefly the case of the prominent women human rights defenders in detention who have been subjected to torture and whose trial is now ongoing. And I'll address briefly the case of women fleeing the country. And lastly, some recommendations and actions to take. So firstly, in terms of women's rights in Saudi Arabia, the most serious impediment is the male guardianship system, which has been in place since the late 1970s and which prevents women from enjoying their basic human rights. They need permission from a male guardian to work, to travel, to study, to marry, and even access health. In short, adult women are treated as legal minors who are not entitled to any control over their lives and are frequently denied the legal right to make decisions on behalf of their children. The women who suffer most are those who have abusive guardians and find that the authorities support whatever brutal or violent treatment they carry out. Saudi Arabia has no laws that offer women adequate protection against domestic abuse and other gender-based violence, and laws relating to marriage and divorce cause many women to be trapped in violent and abusive marriages. Such restrictions have unsurprisingly been fought against for many years, and Saudi Arabia has a rich women's rights movement dating back to the 1990s, made up of women's rights defenders risking their own freedom and safety to reclaim their very basic rights. Some of these names may now be familiar. In the 1990s, we saw a campaign against the ban on women driving, in which several activists, including professors Dr. Aisha Al-Manar, Aziz Al-Yusuf, and Hatoun Al-Farsi, drove their cars in defiance of the ban, and some of them documented it in a book. In terms of the younger generation, we've seen activists such as Sama Badawi and Nasima Al-Sada among the first to bring lawsuits demanding that women be allowed to vote and stand as candidates in elections taking place. And Sama suffered particularly from the male guardianship system as she had an abusive father. And such pressure led to some gains, such as authorities in 2015 allowing women to participate in council elections. Yet the women behind this activism face reprisals and have been targeted for years. The 47 women in the 1990s who took part in this prominent campaign were arrested, and most lost their passports and their jobs temporarily. And more recent examples include Sama Badawi, who in 2014 was banned from taking part in an EU NGO forum. Loujain El-Hadlou was arrested in 2014 and again in March 2018 after attending a UN session in Geneva. And Iman El-Nahjan, who had been writing a blog on women's rights since 2008, was arrested in 2013 for filming a woman driving. And in addition to these examples of reprisals against their activism for women's rights, they are also fighting against a repressive set of laws in Saudi Arabia against all human rights defenders. Some of these include the application of terrorism legislation, such as through the Specialized Criminal Court, which is set up in 2008, and which, using several laws, such as the anti-terror law in 2017, have been used to target activists under vaguely worded terrorism charges. Other laws include the Law on Associations and Foundations of 2015, and such regulations have been used for years to arrest and try human rights offenders for exercising their basic rights. And such crackdown has escalated in recent years, particularly since King Salman came to power and his son and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. And there are estimates of around 5,000 political prisoners at the moment, of which at least 3,000 have been held in excess of 6 months without charge. This crackdown targeted women in particular last year, with a wave of arrests between May and July of at least 13 prominent women human rights offenders, including those who I mentioned earlier. There were also several men arrested who are women's rights activists, such as Mohammed al-Rabia, and while a few were later released, including Asha al-Manar, most remain in detention. These women, in comparison to men who have been detained before, these women have faced particularly intense online trolling and accusations, being accused by pro-government media outlets of being traitors and of betrayal. It's also worth mentioning the family dimension. Many of these, such as Aziz Al-Yusuf, a retired professor, is the mother of 5, a grandmother of 8. Sama Badawi is the mother of 2 young children. And just recently, last week, in the latest wave of arrests of slightly less prominent activists, there was a female writer, Hadija Al-Harbi, who is actually pregnant, and she remains in detention. And in October last year, as I'm sure you're aware, reports emerged that many of these women had been subjected to torture and ill treatment, including being subjected to electric shocks, flogging, sexual assault, and other forms of torture. Testimonies recount that this abuse left some women unable to walk or stand properly, and at least one of them attempted suicide. Such torture of female prisoners is actually quite unprecedented in Saudi Arabia, especially those women such as these who have a relatively high socioeconomic status. So it was really, very significant in the Saudi Arabia context. And more recently, in March this year, 11 of these women were finally brought to trial. And it's revealing, after months of being accused of being foreign spies and traitors, the actual charges, although they haven't been officially released, but they almost entirely relate to their human rights work and their communication with activists, with organizations such as Amnesty and with UN bodies. And in their second trial session, these women recounted the torture they had been subjected to in front of the judges in the Saudi court, which is very powerful. And their next trial session is scheduled for the 17th of April. And just to add, as well as these prominent defenders challenging the system inside Saudi Arabia, there are also many cases of women deciding to flee the country. The most prominent case was Rahaf Mohammed, who in January this year fled the country, and thanks to a prominent social media campaign and advocacy efforts, was granted asylum in Canada. Others, unfortunately, have not been so lucky, such as the case of Dina Allah, who in 2017 fled Saudi Arabia seeking asylum in Australia, but was arrested in the Philippines and returned. It's hard to get a figure of the exact numbers of women fleeing Saudi Arabia. However, the numbers of Saudis seeking asylum in general has risen sharply in the last several years. In 2017, the Saudi asylum in the United States rose by 32%, and in Canada, 13% from the previous year. And 2018 is likely to be similar. And this case of the women human rights offenders and women escaping, of course, exposes the hypocrisy of the Saudi regime, and buzzwords like reform, Vision 2030, and policies like lifting of the female driving ban have been used merely to divert attention from more critical issues such as the male guardianship system, which remain largely intact, or demands for political rights. So the regime has offered rhetorical support, including in their role on the UN Human Rights Council and UN Commission on the Status of Women. And to conclude, it's clear what needs to be done. There needs to be an end to the harassment of women human rights defenders, including those who have been active and bravely campaigning for women's rights for years. There must women must be allowed to exercise their rights, including their rights to freedom of expression, peaceful assembly and association without any judicial harassment or reprisals. We need to see an abolishment of the male guardianship system, which, as mentioned, remains largely intact. And women need to have access to justice and legal aid, which they do not at the moment. In terms of how this can be done, Al-Qis would emphasize the importance of international pressure, given the absence of civil society in Saudi Arabia because of the crackdown. This is particularly important. It was international pressure, or international support, actually, that helped to embolden Mohammed bin Salman in the first place, convinced by his rhetoric of reform. And it was also international pressure, particularly in light of the murder of Khashoggi, which has led to some concessions, such as the Saudi regime acknowledging that it was a state murder. And this is the same with the women. It took a while for their case to generate much international attention. As we saw last summer, Canada was left largely on its own. But more recently, we've seen more international pressure, such as the EU resolution in February, a joint statement at the UN Human Rights Council, and most recently, a joint letter by US senators calling for the release of these women. And such pressure makes a difference, as we have seen in the ongoing case. It was moved from the specialized criminal court to a regular court. And most recently, we've seen the release of 3 of these women, although on a temporary basis. However, we're dealing with a regime intent on total crackdown, so the pressure must be sustained. It must be extended beyond the release of these women, but also call for comprehensive reform, including amending the repressive laws mentioned, ensuring a separation of powers, and abolishing the male guardianship system. So I will leave you there, and hopefully the translation can be sorted. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Cooper, and thank you for speaking on behalf of a number of women who unfortunately can't testify for themselves. I would now like to call on Ms. San Martin once again. Please give your opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Members of the committee, Madam Chair. So I would like to explain my life path and how I came to be a member of the Legislative Assembly of Bolivia, and how I have defended women's rights, specifically with regard to sexual and reproductive rights. That's where I started, and then I broadened the scope of my activities. But I will explain that in Latin America, and specifically in Bolivia, we have to recognize that the structure of society is not neutral. It really is a masculine enclave. There is patriarchy that comes with masculine values, and that is throughout society. There are levels of violence that are the highest in the region. And this we can see on a daily basis. Women are under attack, they are assaulted, they are subject to violence in the home. And this is all part of the structural problems that we have in our society. And this happens in the public sphere as well, when women start to exercise their political rights, not only by voting, but also by representing others. There have been a number of examples of progress when it comes to women's rights in Bolivia, and it began with the vote for women in 1952. And then there was a quota law in the 90s for political participation. And in 2009, there was a recognition in the country's constitution of women's equality. There has been a great deal of participation by women activists to be able to achieve this, and there's also an effort within the government to achieve the same number of women and men within the institutions of government. So I think that the patriarchal structure still remains in one place, and that is where there we are talking about the president and the vice president, because there is no requirement for parity, for gender parity. But there is a bill that we would like to present to solve that problem. But the progress with regard to effective participation by women has made it possible for us to be almost 54% of women in the Legislative Assembly. And I have seen this, I have worked toward it as well, and what I've seen in the last few years with regard to gender parity is that only 25% of women in the Legislative Assembly actually get to make decisions. So what I mean is that they are not the chairs of committees, they do not have the positions that would enable them to make decisions. They are relegated to secondary status. There are no women who are the leader of a political party nationally either. So given this political participation by women and its characteristics, as well as the violence against women in the private sphere and in the public sphere, there was a bill that was adopted in 2013 that came from the murder of a municipal representative in one of the provinces of Bolivia, in Oruro. And it was the result of the pressure on her by the patriarchy. And the bill adopted in 2013 was there to regulate political harassment against women. It's a very detailed bill. It explains what harassment is, what violence is in that context as well. But there is a problem with the enforcement of that detailed bill. In the National Assembly, there was a study carried out by an NGO that shows that only 75% of the women, or in fact, 75% of the women in the Legislative Assembly have suffered from political harassment or violence. But when you look at how many times this has been actually revealed or spoken about by women, from 2016 to 2018, there have only been 95 denunciations. So that doesn't mean that there are no cases of harassment. What it means is that women are under pressure to not make any kinds of accusations with regard to political harassment or violence, given the nuances of belonging to a given gender or to a given party. And it's also a reflection of the way the judicial body in our country works. Because when it comes to violence against women, and that is in both spheres, private and public, not just political, but it's very rare to have a sentence applied to someone who is accused of violence against women. And it can take 5 to 6 years to even get a ruling on a case, even for the murder of a woman. There was a woman police officer, a sergeant, who was attacked by her husband, who was also a police officer. And the police, the system, was not supportive of that woman. They did not take disciplinary measures against the police officer who committed the assault against his wife. So that gives you an idea of the hope that women have when they do accuse someone of violence, be it domestic violence, gender violence. And we can see in the political sphere as well that things are not changing. There have been no sentences handed down, only one, in fact, with regard to political harassment and violence. So it is very unlikely for women to accuse anyone of that crime under that legislation. And that also has to do with the corruption within the system, and in fact, minimize the victim and do not protect the victim as they should.
This leads to a number of laws, including Law 348, which is the one that applies to gender-based violence and domestic violence, and Law 243 on political violence and harassment, and end up being very well-intentioned laws, but that lack coercive power. So they cannot be correctly enforced by the judicial branch. And this happens systematically. I myself have been a victim of political harassment and violence, and I have been unable to be heard by an impartial body that acts rapidly enough to address the case. Therefore, all of these bills that are drafted related to women and that meet certain demands, even international demands, end up as dead letters on paper without enforcement. Now, talking about those of us, men and women, who defend sexual and reproductive rights, this remains a taboo subject in our society, and within the state apparatus itself, it is made invisible. The education ministry, for example, forbids NGOs for working in schools on these issues without prior authorization from the education ministry, and that authorization is never granted. So it ends up being an obstacle that prevents one of the most important measures to reduce the very large number of clandestine abortions that take place in Bolivia. And also related to sexual and reproductive rights, speaking of abortion, the state has not been able to offer guarantees nor change the law in order to guarantee safe abortions for women. Having said all this, I think that it's very important to, in the future, think about networks to make more visible matters such as sexual and reproductive rights in Latin American countries that still hold on to these taboos and prejudices. On the other hand, we must also advocate for greater education at every level. Now, internationally, I think that it's very important to receive international support from various countries in order to make sure that these laws don't remain simply as unenforced laws without the coercive power to be able to, in fact, transform a situation that is very concerning in Bolivia.
Over your time, so if I can ask that you just summarize very quickly.
Perfecto.
Of course, yes, I can end there. I think that, again, these networks are very important to make these issues visible, as well as international support. Thank you.
And I failed to mention at the beginning that Ms. San Martin is a parliamentarian as well. She's a member of the Chamber of Deputies in Bolivia. And we will start the questions now with Mr. Anderson for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to both of our witnesses for being with us today. Ms. San Martin, you've given us both positive and negatives of what's happening in your country. You've talked about levels of violence that are highest in the region, some issues of impunity and corruption, but you've also talked about the general direction of the government's interest in parity and human rights support, it seems like. I'm just wondering, the political situation or political direction in Bolivia, does that give you hope or fear? And I'm just wondering, how does that compare to the countries around you?
Well, to begin, thank you very much for the question, David. Currently, we are about to hold elections in the month of October after a very important crisis in our elections authority. There were a number of members who have passed their resignations and challenges to electoral results having gone through a referendum where the people said no to a third re-election of President Evo Morales. this has not been respected by the executive, by President Evo Morales, who is once again running for re-election. And this means overall, in general terms, about the political situation in Bolivia. Now, specifically speaking to women's rights, even though there is plenty of rhetoric that supports women's rights, I see that in fact, Law 243 of 2013 and Law 348 of 2012 have not borne fruit because there hasn't been the political will to modify the structures in the judicial branch. And this is important because we don't see, again, the political will. Because once again, the judicial body has been manipulated and employed by the party itself for political means, for political prosecution or persecution.
Mr. Cooper, I wanted to ask you a question about the role of the new Crown Prince. You brought him into this and kind of in the middle of the discussion. We've heard lots about this, this new freedom to drive vehicles, and I guess from outside you don't know whether that's a substantive change in rights or just a cover for other bad behavior. But I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about his role. He seems to get better publicity than he probably deserves. But I'm just wondering if you talk about his role in the human rights issues in Saudi Arabia and what role does he play. And then a second question I'd like to know is what level of freedom do women human rights defenders actually have? What are where are the lines that they can't cross? Do they start very early, kind of in the discussion, or do they have some freedom and then there's a sudden clampdown on their activity?
Sure. Well, yeah, thanks very much for those important questions. In terms of the role of Mohammed bin Salman, Al-Qist have certainly documented a substantial shift in terms of the scope and the scale of the crackdown in Saudi Arabia since he assumed power effectively in 2017, in terms of the widening of the targeting against human rights offenders. In the past, yes, in the 2000s and in recent years, there have always been crackdown on dissent, but it really escalated in scale, including the targeting of women in particular. And I mentioned beforehand how some of these women had faced reprisals in the past, such as in the 1990s, and the arrest of Lujan and Iman and Afshan in the early 2010s. However, there was some barriers or some restraint in terms of the attacks upon them, such as torture, which historically has not been so prevalent in Saudi Arabia compared to neighbouring countries. So you've seen practices like this, torture, sexual violence, are really quite unprecedented. In terms of now, on the second question, on the space for women human rights defenders, I mean, the targeting of the dozens of women human rights defenders last year, they were really the most prominent women human rights defenders. So there aren't really any other defenders out there in Saudi Arabia anymore. And the latest wave of arrests just last week, we saw, I think there's now 10 confirmed arrests of slightly less prominent activists, including one or two women.
I'm sorry to interrupt. If I may just ask you to move your phone a little bit further from the microphone, because we're getting some interference on this side. Thank you. Okay, sorry about that. So yeah, just to conclude, I would say the space is really is really at an all-time low. Obviously, we'll see how the trial pans out at the moment, and the release of 3 of the women is a positive sign. However, much more needs to be done.
Canada's been fairly aggressive in calling for the release of Badawi's, for example, and others. And when we've done that, the Saudi Foreign Ministry basically calls that a blatant interference in foreign affairs, or in the kingdom's domestic affairs, rather. So I'm just wondering, how does Saudi Arabia then react to international pressure to free women human rights defenders? Are they responsive to it, or is it just written off with those kinds of comments? Or they actually take it seriously when they start getting that kind of pressure? Can we make a difference by pressuring them?
Sure. The role of Canada, while applaudable last summer, was unfortunate that Canada did not receive adequate support from the rest of the international community, such as the UK and the US. But I would still emphasize the importance of the international role, particularly, as I mentioned, the fact that there aren't journalists, there aren't human rights defenders able to speak out in Saudi Arabia itself. So it's really befalls upon the international community to speak on behalf of them. And as I mentioned briefly in the presentation, there are some positive signs of more coordinated efforts at the EU level, at the UN level, such as the joint statement led by Iceland, which I believe Canada signed, and other countries like the UK. So I would say these sort of efforts are welcome and do have some impact. So even though the latest wave of arrests in Saudi Arabia are somewhat shocking, because they come at a time when there is increased scrutiny upon Saudi Arabia in light of Khashoggi and the woman. However, I think we still do see the Saudi authorities, unlike maybe some countries, they do care about their image to some extent, and we've seen some concessions, such as the release of the woman a few weeks ago, although on a temporary basis. The moving of the court from the specialized criminal court, which is really the worst type of court, to a more regular criminal court, and other concessions such as the end of the torture when there was increased international pressure, such as the UK. Some UK parliamentarians called to visit the prisons inside Saudi Arabia to see the torture for themselves and to report on it. The torture and ill treatment did subside after that. So yeah, I would emphasize the importance of it on, unfortunately, not as much as we would like, but it still can be very vital.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll now move to Mr. Tabera for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the witnesses for being here today, and thank you for giving voices for those that often don't have, our voices are marginalized. I wanted to begin with Mr. Cooper. If I'm looking at a bit of stats at Saudi Arabia here, in 2015, 52% of university graduates were females. That number climbs a bit higher when you have a postgraduate degree. The GDP growth is around 4% in some years, around in 2015, 2016. And 50% of Saudis are below the age of 25. In 2016, Saudi Arabia launched a Saudi vision, and their vision was in 2030 that they want to reduce their dependency on oil and diversify its economy with renewable energy. And where I'm getting with all these stats is, with these stats, it shows that it's relatively a progressive country with just these stats, but we see a big hindrance in women's advancements. And I know in your testimony you talked about the male guardianship. If we see so many graduates and we see many youth, do we not see that many of the male figures in Saudi Arabia pushing for more advancements, for pushing for more rights for women? Or is that being hindered because of this guardianship? And is that being hindered because it's taboo to speak out for women's rights?
Sure. Well, the figures you point at do highlight some of the positive steps in the sort of social and education spheres, particularly in recent years, which are welcome steps. I believe someone raised earlier the point of the female women driving ban, which women had been fighting for years against. So these steps are welcome, but they, I would argue, are more of a deflection around more political rights for women, and do not address more fundamental rights, such as the male guardianship system, which still remains very intact, I'd say these sort of buzzwords are not sort of very sincere in terms of realizing the full rights of women. And I would say, yeah, that the arrest of the women's rights activists and the cases of women fleeing the country are not sort of exceptions to the rule, are not kind of mistakes born out of a slightly reckless leader, but are really systematic sort of events which really, yeah, get to the heart of the political will of the regime to respect women's rights and women human rights defenders in particular.
And Ms. Karasako, I wanted to mention, kind of leading into that as well, in your testimony, you said that there have been made steps for women to get into political roles, but however, there's been targets, there's been quotas. However, they haven't been in committee chairs or leaders of political parties. Has there been within government? Have you seen male allies that have pushed for this advancement as well, and pushed for women's roles to be in higher government roles as well?
Yes. In fact, I feel that there is a big difference between formal equality and substantive equality. In terms of substantive equality, of a full exercise of women's political rights, there remains, we have made great progress, but there is a long road ahead related to decision making. With respect to your question about allies, yes, we've made progress. I think that we do have male allies who have contributed to our cause to advance and make qualitative advancement of women's rights. Nonetheless, I think that we could talk about individuals, and in that sense, what I don't yet see is will by the state as a whole to turn this willingness and this desire and this rhetoric and this discourse into a reality, into concrete facts and tangible facts. We see this, for instance, in the justice reform, which in my opinion is one of the pillars for women's rights through existing legislation to be made effective. For example, a few weeks ago, we lost a major European Union fund that was earmarked for justice reform because the Ministry of Justice has been unable to implement a plan and a program for justice reform, which is what I mentioned before is, in my opinion, the most important aspect of this.
Mr. Garrison, for 7 minutes. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you very much. I want to thank both our witnesses for being here today. In particular, I want to thank Ms. San Martin for the work that she's doing in Bolivia in the face of reports that show incredible levels of harassment and violence against women in Bolivia. I want to start by asking you, Ms. San Martin, if Canada wishes to help women human rights defenders in Bolivia, what are the most effective ways in which we could do so?
Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Mr. Gerritsen. I think that the most important thing to do is to strengthen civil society and to have a truly independent civil society. It requires mechanisms to monitor state bodies, and those who carry out justice. This is very important, and I think that what Canada can do to help is to help strengthen civil society and generate monitoring and information generation mechanisms. So that will strengthen leadership by women and women human rights defenders who work on the ground. I think that's important. And this, of course, goes to all levels. There are activists with all kinds of different backgrounds. There are activists who are doctors, economists as well. So it's not just grassroots, it's all through the levels of society. There's also help required with regard to economics for women, how they make their living, their reproductive and sexual rights as well. They work in all of those areas, and they need to be supported. Thank you.
Capacity in monitoring and information reporting. Specifically, how would you envision doing that? Is that through running training courses? Is that for providing core assistance to organizations who are doing that on the ground? What ways would that be most effective in trying to help do that?
Yo creo que sí es importante.
Yes, I think it would take funding for organizations that work in the field, so core funding. And I think there's also need for training. In Bolivia, there's also a great limitation on foundations and NGOs. They can't work appropriately without supervision by the government. There was an act that was adopted 5 or 6 years ago, which cut funding greatly and cut the support that was being given to civil society organizations. These foundations and NGOs have always been very critical of the government, whichever government it happens to be. So I think that it's very important to find the proper mechanisms to support the organizations through funding and training so that the women and men who defend human rights can in turn be supported.
An international organization or another government, would that cause problems for them in terms of legitimacy?
Yo voy a ser muy clara.
I will speak very clearly. With regard to problems, well, those are generated when the funds come from the United States. There is an ongoing type of rhetoric here that focuses on the imperialist force of the United States. It's very different for Canada.
Thanks very much. I want to turn to Mr. Cooper for a moment and ask a little bit about your organization and ALCIST. And how are women's rights and human rights defenders, are they integrated into the overall work of your organization, or is it a separate stream of work? How do you actually deal with that when confronting human rights in Saudi Arabia?
Sure. Well, ALCIST really depends on its networks, because it's based in the UK, but is entirely dependent on networks within Saudi Arabia itself. So in the past, it has worked closely and alongside several women human rights defenders in Saudi Arabia. Obviously, since more recently, since the crackdown, it's become increasingly difficult to find sources and contacts within Saudi Arabia, and so it is based in the UK, but has a range of male and female activists in the diaspora, such as in Europe and in America. I mean, there are many prominent Saudi women in the diaspora, such as Hala al-Dosari in the United States and Madawiya Rashid, who obviously are not working with ALCIST, but are real sources with inside knowledge on Saudi Arabia. And obviously some of the ALCIST team must remain anonymous because of fears of reprisals and such forth. We really depend on such networks because it's crucial for the information to get out, and ALCIST are one of the kind of principal sources of information relating to Saudi Arabia. So with the ongoing trial or the torture, ALCIST through these networks is one of the sort of first points of contact for what's going on.
In your presentation, you mentioned some positive activities of Canada in defense of human rights defenders, and I have to maybe do a footnote here to say I have some trouble when we continue to sell arms to Saudi Arabia. That, to me, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, to me that wipes out some of the other part of the ledger. But can you talk a little bit more about, it seemed to be that it was Canada and also people from the UK and doing prison visits, observations, trials, those kinds of things. Do you find those effective ways of, letting Saudi Arabia know the international community is watching?
Yes, I would emphasize the importance of these advocacy steps, such as Canada's last year, although, as I mentioned, was unfortunately Canada was left rather isolated, but now we're seeing more pressure, unfortunately mostly still at parliamentary level, such as the UK parliamentary initiative was just by members of parliament and was not met by government itself with statements and such forth. So there's still a lot of work to be done, but there are signs of encouragement, particularly at the UN level. We've seen across countries wide criticism of the human rights situation and focused around the women human rights defenders, which I think it is an issue which resonates quite rightly and is symbolic of the wider crackdown, and is really something which the international community should rally behind. But we're pushing for more pressure at government level. Unfortunately, the UK behind the scenes, it kind of says it raises these issues, but it doesn't always do so forcefully enough. And with Canada, with the arms sales, continues to arm Saudi Arabia. And just today in the UK, we're seeing a court case against the UK's selling of arms against Saudi Arabia. So it'll be interesting how that turns out.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I want to thank both of our witnesses. I want to thank Ms. San Martin for being available once again, and Mr. Cooper, both of you, for your very informative testimony today and the important work that you're doing. Just to remind committee members that on Thursday we will be in camera because we'll be discussing committee business, and a reminder that because we lost one meeting, we originally had planned to do a joint meeting with the Foreign Affairs Committee on May the 9th and not hold our meeting. We will still be doing the joint meeting at 8:45 a.m., but we will also be holding our meeting at 1 o'clock, the regularly scheduled meeting on the 9th of May. And an updated calendar is going to be distributed for committee members shortly. And with that, thank you very much, and we'll adjourn our meeting.